Gilgamesh Part II. Gilgamesh spoke then, "We go to kill the Evil One, Humbaba. We must prove ourselves more powerful than he." Enkidu was afraid of the forest of Humbaba and urged him not to go. But he was not as strong as Gilgamesh in argument, and they were friends. They had embraced and made their vow to stay together always, no matter what the obstacle. Enkidu tried to hold his fear, but he was sick at heart. "I feel the weakness that I felt before come over my body, as if I tried to lift my arms and found that they were hollow." "It is Humbaba who has taken your strength," Gilgamesh spoke out, anxious for the journey. "We must kill him and end his evil power over us." "No," Enkidu cried out. "It is the journey that will take away our life." "Don't be afraid," said Gilgamesh. "We are together. There is nothing we should fear." "I learned," Enkidu said, "when I lived with the animals never to go down into that forest. I learned that there is death in Humbaba. Why do you want to raise his anger?" Only half listening, Gilgamesh thought out aloud about the cedars he would climb. "How can we climb those cedars?" Enkidu tried to sway his thoughts. "Humbaba never sleeps. He is the guardian whom Enlil has commanded to protect the sacred trees by terror. I have learned his sound is like a flood sound, slowly forming in the distance, then enveloping all other sounds. Even the cries of animals cannot be heard. Trees are hushed, the wind still moves them back and forth, but noiselessly, and when one senses violence gathering its force, soon there is no sound apart from it, not even one's own thoughts in terror. I have learned that from his mouth springs fire that scorches the earth in a moment. There is nothing left alive, no tree, no insect, as in a dream that makes one wake and cry out of the pain one cannot find the source of, out of nothing. One wakes and everything has vanished. I have learned Humbaba is the face of death. He hears each insect crawling towards the edge of the forest. He twitches and it dies. Do you think he could not hear two men?" "Why are you worried about death? Only the gods are immortal anyway," sighed Gilgamesh. "What men do is nothing, so fear is never justified. What happened to your power that once could challenge and equal mine? I will go ahead of you, and if I die I will at least have the reward of having people say he died in war against Humbaba. You cannot discourage me with fears and hesitations. I will fight Humbaba. I will cut his cedars, tell the armorers to build us two-edged swords and double shields, and tell them I am impatient and cannot wait long." Thus Gilgamesh and Enkidu went together to the marketplace to notify the elders of Uruk, who were meeting in their senate. They too were talking of Humbaba, as they often did, edging always in their thoughts toward the forbidden. "The one you speak of," Gilgamesh addressed them, "I now must meet. I want to prove him not the awesome thing we think he is, and that the boundaries set up by gods are not unbreakable. I will defeat him in his cedar forest. The youth of Uruk need this fight. They have grown soft and restless." The old men leaned a little forward, remembering old wars. A blush burned on their cheeks. It seemed a little dangerous, and yet they saw their king was seized with passion for this fight. Their voices gave the confidence his friend had failed to give. Some even said Enkidu's wisdom was a sign of cowardice. "You see, my friend," laughed Gilgamesh, "the wise of Uruk have outnumbered you." Amidst the speeches in the hall that called upon the gods for their protection, Gilgamesh saw in his friend that pain he had seen before and asked him what it was that troubled him. Enkidu could not speak. He held his tears back. Barely audibly he said, "It is a road which you have never traveled." The armorers brought to Gilgamesh his weapons and put them in his hand. He took his quiver. bow and axe and two-edged sword, and they began to march. The elders gave their austere blessing, and the people shouted, "Let Enkidu lead. Don't trust your strength. He knows the forests. The one who goes ahead will save his friend. May Shamash bring you victory." Enkidu was resolved to lead his friend, who was determined but did not know the way. Gilgamesh was certain with his friend beside him. They went to Ninsun and his mother, who would advise them how to guard their steps. Her words still filled his mind as they started their journey, just as a mother's voice is heard sometimes in a man's mind long past childhood, calling his name, calling him from sleep or from some pleasurable moment on a foreign street, when every trace of origin seems left and one has almost passed into a land that promises a vision or the secret of one's life, when one feels almost God enough to be free of voices. Her voice calls out like a voice from childhood, reminding him he once tossed in dreams. He still could smell the incense she had burned to Shamash, saying, "Why did you give my son a restless heart? And now you touch him with the passion to destroy Humbaba, and you send him on a journey to a battle he may never understand, to a door he cannot open. You inspire him to end the evil of the world which you abhor, and yet he is a man for all his power, and cannot do your work. You must protect my son from danger." And called Enkidu to her side, and said, "You are not my son, but I adopt you, and call upon the same protection now for you I once called upon for Gilgamesh." She placed a charm around his neck and said, "Oh, let Enkidu now protect his friend." These words still filled their minds as the two friends continued on their way. After 3 days they reached the edge of the forest where Humbaba's watchman stood. Suddenly it was Gilgamesh who was afraid. Enkidu who reminded him to be fearless. The watchman sounded his warning to Humbaba. The two friends moved slowly toward the forest gate. When Enkidu touched the gate his hand felt numb. He could not move his fingers or his wrist. His face turned pale like someone's witnessing a death. He tried to ask his friend for help, whom he had just encouraged to move on, but he could only stutter and hold out his paralyzed hand. "It will pass," said Gilgamesh. "Would you want to stay behind because of that? We must go into the forest together. Forget your fear of death. I will go before you and protect you." Enkidu followed close behind, so filled with fear he could not think or speak. Soon they reached the high cedars. They stood in awe at the foot of the green mountain. Pleasure seemed to grow from fear for Gilgamesh. As when one comes upon a path in woods unvisited by men, one is drawn near the lost and undiscovered in himself. He was revitalized by danger. They knew it was the path Humbaba made. Some called the forest hell, and others paradise. "What difference does it make?" said Gilgamesh. But night was falling quickly, and they had no time to call it names, except perhaps the dark. Before they found a place at the edge of the forest to serve as shelter for their sleep. It was a restless night for both. One snatched at sleep and sprang awake from dreams. The other could not rest because of pain that spread throughout his side. Enkidu was alone with sights he saw brought on by pain and fear, as one in deep despair might lie beside his love who sleeps and seems so unafraid, absorbing in himself the phantoms that she cannot see. Phantoms diminished for one who, when two can see and stay awake to talk of them and search out a solution of despair, or lie together in each other's arms, or weep in exhaustion from their tears, perhaps find laughter for their fears. But alone and awake, the size and nature of the creatures in his mind grow monstrous, beyond the resemblance to the creatures he had known before the prostitute had come into his life. He cried aloud for them to stop appearing over him. emerging from behind the trees was with phosphorescent eyes brought on by rain. He could not hear his voice, but knew he screamed, and could not move his arms, but thought they tried to move, as if a heavy weight he could not raise, or wriggle out from underneath, had settled on his chest, like a turtle trapped beneath a fallen branch. Each effort only added to paralysis. He could not make his friend, his one companion, hear. Gilgamesh awoke, but could not hear his friend in agony. He was still captive to his dreams, which he would tell aloud to exercise. I saw us standing in a mountain gorge. A rock slide fell on us. We seemed no more than insects under it. And then a solitary, graceful man appeared and pulled me out from under the mountain. He gave me water and I felt released. Tomorrow you will be victorious, Enkidu said, to whom the dream brought chills, for only one of them he knew would be released, which Gilgamesh could not perceive in the darkness, for he went back to sleep without responding to his friend's interpretation of his dream. Did you call me? Gilgamesh sat up again. Why did I wake again? I thought you touched me. Why am I afraid? I felt my limbs grew numb, as if some god passed over us, drawing out our life. I had another dream. This time the heavens were alive with fire. But soon the clouds began to thicken. Death rained down on us. The lightning flashes stopped, and everything which rained down turned to ashes. What does this mean, Enkidu? That you will be victorious against Humbaba, Enkidu said, or someone said through him, because he could not hear his voice or move his limbs, although he thought he spoke. And soon he saw his friend sleep beside him. At dawn Gilgamesh raised his axe and struck at the great cedar. When Humbaba heard the sound of falling trees, he hurried down the path that they had seen, but only he had traveled. Gilgamesh felt weak at the sound of Humbaba's footsteps and called to Shamash, saying, I have followed you in the way decreed. Why am I abandoned now? Suddenly the winds sprang up. They saw the great head of Humbaba like a water buffalo's bellowing down the path, his huge and clumsy legs, his flailing arms thrashing at phantoms in his precious trees. His single stroke could cut a cedar down and leave no mark on him. His shoulders, like a porter's under building stones, were permanently bent by what he bore. He was the slave who did the work for gods, but whom the gods would never notice. Monstrous in his contortion, he aroused the two almost to pity, but pity was the thing that might have killed. It made them pause just long enough him to show how pitiless he was to them. Gilgamesh in horror saw him strike the back of Enkidu and beat him to the ground until he thought his friend was crushed to death. He stood still watching as the monster leaned to make his final strike against his friend, unable to move to help him. And then Enkidu slid along the ground like a ram making its final lunge on wounded knees. Humbaba fell and seemed to crack the ground itself in two, and Gilgamesh, as if this fall had snapped him from his daze, returned to life and stood over Humbaba with his axe raised high above his head, watching the monster plead in strangled sobs and desperate appeals the way the sea contorts under a violent squall. I'll serve you as I served the gods, Humbaba said. I'll build you houses from their sacred trees. Enkidu feared his friend was weakening and called out, Gilgamesh, don't trust him, as if there was some hunger in himself that Gilgamesh was feeling that turned him momentarily to yearn for someone who would serve. He paused and then he raised his axe up higher and swung it in a perfect arc into Humbaba's neck. He reached out to touch the wounded shoulder of his friend, and late that night he reached again to see if he was yet asleep, but there was only quiet breathing. The stars against the midnight sky were sparkling like mica in a riverbed. In the slight breeze, the head of Humbaba was swinging from a tree.